Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to unpack the dramatic historical mechanisms of dictatorial economic control. Specifically, we'll be examining Benito Mussolini's 1926 monetary interventions in Italy. It's an absolutely fascinating look at what happens when a government tries to force financial markets to just bend to its political will. And we're going to explore exactly how they did it, step by step.
Okay, let's dive right in. Take a look at this visceral declaration of economic war. I will defend the lira to the last breath, to the last drop of blood. That right there shows you exactly how high the stakes were for the fascist regime. On August 18, 1926, standing in a public square in Pesaro, Italy, Mussolini delivered this speech, officially launching what he called the battle for the lira. And this wasn't just standard political rhetoric. It was a literal promise to manipulate the entire national economy to defend a single currency target, whatever the cost.
Just to ground us in reality for a second, here's the actual physical currency at the heart of this historical thriller, the Italian lira. You've got a 1922 coin and a 50 lira banknote. This was the everyday money citizens used to buy their groceries and pay their rent, right? And it was this exact asset the state was frantically trying to artificially manipulate on the global stage.
Section 1. Italy's Mountain of Debt.
So, to understand why the state took such extreme measures, we really have to look at the severe crisis they were facing. The backdrop to this whole economic drama is a literal mountain of debt that threatened to crush the Italian economy entirely. Coming out of World War I, Italy's public debt peaked at a staggering 180% of its gross domestic product by 1921. 180%. To put that into perspective, the government owed nearly double what the entire country could produce in a single year. Naturally, this massive debt burden caused severe monetary instability, huge capital flight, and a really sharp depreciation of the currency. The whole country was basically in the throes of severe socioeconomic and political turmoil.
So how exactly did they get into this massive hole? Well, for years, the state had been aggressively borrowing domestically to fund the war effort. Between 1914 and 1920, they issued 6 distinct national loans. And, as you might guess, by the end of this period, these loans had snowballed into a completely unmanageable crisis. The government was stuck in this vicious cycle, just constantly rolling over massive amounts of short-term debt simply to keep the lights on.
Section 2. The Quota 90 Policy.
Using newly designed currency, like this 1,000 lira banknote, the regime's goal was to aggressively revalue their money. They really wanted to project this aura of absolute national strength. But critically, they also wanted to secure desperately needed stabilization loans from foreign bankers, specifically powerful American financiers like JP Morgan. The thinking was, by presenting an image of a super strong currency and a perfectly balanced budget, the government believed they could win back the trust of international capital markets.
But here's where things get wild. There was a massive gap between what global markets said the currency was actually worth versus the artificial target the state just mandated out of thin air. In 1926, the free market exchange rate was hovering around 148 to 150 lira to the British pound. But Mussolini decreed that the value would be reset to 90 lira to the pound. Why 90? Because that was the rate when he took power in 1922. This Quota 90 policy was a massive, forced overvaluation of the currency that completely ignored the reality of the global markets.
Of course, you can't just declare a currency as suddenly worth way more without some severe consequences. The human toll of this policy was immediate and brutal. To balance the budget, defend this whole illusion of control, and secure a $100 million stabilization loan from American banks, the government forced through intense austerity measures. Real wages for Italian workers were slashed by about 20% between 1921 and 1929. Seriously, imagine your paycheck being cut by a fifth, practically overnight. That was the grim reality for citizens as the state protected its international image at the total expense of domestic workers. Section 3. Forced Conversions and Defaults.
So when those initial austerity measures weren't enough to calm the intense domestic funding pressures, the government turned directly on its own people's savings. In November 1926, the state executed the littoral loan, and this was a mandatory forced conversion. Basically, if you were an entrepreneur or a bank holding short-term government bills for your day-to-day liquidity, you were suddenly ordered to just surrender them. In exchange, you were forced to accept 9-year, highly illiquid state bonds, paying just 5%. I mean, this was effectively a partial state default. It's estimated that investors and businesses lost around 5 billion lira because of this sudden draconian move. Unsurprisingly, the secondary market price of government debt absolutely plummeted.
And amazingly, they actually did it again.
In 1934, despite promising not to touch the debt until 1936, the government forced another conversion. They took that 5% consolidated debt from 1926 and forced investors into even lower yields of 3.5%. Oh, and they stretched the repayment terms out to a staggering 40 years. 40 years! As you can imagine, this absolutely devastated the state's borrowing reputation. The public, very understandably, lost all appetite for voluntarily holding any government debt.
Section 4. The Financial Repression Tax.
Because investors flat out refused to voluntarily buy government debt after these repeated defaults, the regime found itself completely starved for cash. This led to a strategy known in economics as financial repression. Rather than asking citizens for loans on the open market, the government just manipulated the entire financial system to covertly trap domestic wealth. They monopolize the savings system, limit the investment options available to citizens, and then force local banks to hold government debt at artificially low interest rates. When you boil it down, it's essentially a hidden form of taxation.
Using everyday currency, like this 100 lira note, the government enacted extreme capital controls. They instituted really high reserve requirements for banks and actively severed the Italian economy from international financial reality. If you had money in Italy, the state made sure there was no way you could move it abroad to seek better returns. Your capital was entirely trapped within their borders, sitting in banks that the state was busy taking over.
And you've got to see the sheer scale of that takeover. By wiping out private competition, bailing out failing mixed banks, and nationalizing institutions through the 1936 banking law, the fascist regime took total command of credit allocation. Look at this. By 1936, a massive 80% of all banking loans were controlled by state-owned entities. The state literally became the banking system. This ensured that any money deposited was at their absolute disposal.
They perfected this through a highly deliberate three-step mechanism known as the Circuito dei Capitali, or the Circuit of Capital. It's like a giant puzzle. Step 1. Eliminate alternatives. They did this by taxing stock market capital gains at an incredible 50%. Step 2. Artificially reduce what citizens can voluntarily consume through strict price and wage controls. And finally, Step 3. Take those captive private savings sitting in the banks and mercilessly funnel them straight back into state bonds. This closed-loop system ensured that every single drop of wealth in the economy was directed straight to the Treasury, specifically to fund their impending military expansion.
Section 5. The Cost of Control.
Ultimately, we have to objectively look at the real-world consequences here. Did this massive overreach actually solve their economic problems? Well, the final fallout is incredibly telling. Sure, the central planners managed to technically halt the explosive debt growth, stabilizing the debt-to-GDP ratio near 90%, but the cost? Absolutely catastrophic. By forcing the Quota 90 policy, the economy suffered crushing, prolonged deflation that completely crippled domestic industry. Through financial repression, the government extracted an invisible tax equivalent to about 7% of the entire GDP annually between 1933 and 1939. That is huge. And finally, their ruined financial reputation meant they couldn't borrow abroad at all, driving Italy into a strict, isolated economic autarky. They systematically drained the wealth of their own citizens just to achieve an illusion of economic strength.
It's such a fascinating historical case study, right? It perfectly illustrates the actual mechanics of financial repression. When you see a state artificially manipulating its currency, forcing conversions on investors, and trapping domestic savings, the economic reality rarely matches the political rhetoric. It leaves us with this final, really provocative thought to consider about the delicate balance between state authority and economic reality. When a government tightly controls the money and monopolizes savings, who ultimately pays the price? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the mechanics behind the money.